Attention! This channel provides original historical analysis based on sources and research. We do not simply recount events, we analyze their causes and consequences, explaining them through original narration, editing, and visual diagrams. A list of sources is included in the description. Enjoy watching. Welcome back. Today we are examining a specific moment in the Second World War, one that reveals how intelligence, no matter how accurate, cannot always change the outcome of a conflict already lost at the strategic level. This is the story of how German test pilots flew captured American P-51 Mustangs, assessed them with professional precision, and reported their findings to a command that had no answer. The facts speak for themselves. In the winter of 1944, a test pilot named Werner Lerche climbed into the cockpit of a captured American fighter at a secure airfield near Berlin. The aircraft was a North American P-51 Mustang. It had come down intact in Austria after its pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Todd of the 318th Fighter Squadron, made a forced landing on December 9, 1944, following deteriorating weather conditions that left him unable to navigate back to friendly territory. Todd became a prisoner of war. His aircraft became one of the most significant intelligence prizes the Luftwaffe captured during the entire conflict. Lerche was not an ordinary pilot. Over the course of the war, he had flown approximately 125 different aircraft types without ever crashing or seriously damaging a single machine. He was a qualified engineer as well as an aviator, a methodical, analytical man who approached each new aircraft with systematic precision. His assignment was straightforward: evaluate the Mustang, document its performance, and report his findings to Luftwaffe Command. What he discovered during that test flight confirmed what combat experience had already begun to suggest. The P-51 was not simply a capable fighter. It was a machine that combined speed, range, and high-altitude performance in a way that no German piston-engine aircraft could match. Each quality reinforced the others. Together, they created an aircraft that had fundamentally changed the nature of the air war over Europe. To understand why that mattered, it is necessary to go back several months, to a period when the strategic bombing offensive against Germany was in serious difficulty. Through 1942 and most of 1943, American heavy bombers flying from bases in England had been striking targets inside the Reich. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were robust, well-armed aircraft. But they were bombers, not fighters. When German interceptors rose to meet them, the results were often catastrophic. The Luftwaffe's defense of Reich airspace had been carefully designed to exploit a single critical weakness in the Allied bombing campaign. American escort fighters, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, could accompany bomber formations only as far as the Belgian or Dutch border, perhaps 200 miles into hostile territory. Beyond that boundary, the bombers flew alone. German fighter controllers tracked incoming formations by radar, calculated where the American escorts would be forced to turn back for lack of fuel, and positioned their interceptors accordingly. The system worked with brutal efficiency. On August 17, 1943, a force of 376 B-17s struck the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt Aircraft Works at Regensburg. Of those 376 bombers, 60 were shot down, and a further 55 were so severely damaged that they never flew again. On October 14, 1943, a second Schweinfurt raid saw 60 bombers destroyed out of 291 dispatched, a loss rate of more than 20% on a single mission. At that rate of attrition, the strategic bombing campaign could not be sustained. The Americans understood the problem clearly. What they needed was an escort fighter capable of accompanying the bombers all the way to the target and back, a radius of action exceeding 400 miles from bases in England, sufficient to reach Berlin itself. In the spring and summer of 1943, that aircraft did not exist in operational service. By the autumn of the same year, it was beginning to arrive in England in meaningful numbers. It was the P-51 Mustang, and its appearance over Germany in escort strength during the winter of 1943 to 1944 marked the moment when the air war began to turn. The Mustang was not an accidental success. It was the product of deliberate engineering, industrial investment, and a fortunate combination of American airframe design with British engine technology. The North American Aviation Company had designed the aircraft's fuselage and distinctive laminar flow wing. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in the United States, had provided the power and altitude performance that transformed a capable but limited design into something exceptional. When Lerche climbed into the cockpit at that airfield outside Berlin, the aircraft he was evaluating had already been flying combat missions over his country for more than a year. His assessment would be thorough and accurate. It would also arrive far too late to change anything. The story of how the Luftwaffe came to possess flyable American fighters begins not with any deliberate plan, but with the ordinary chaos of aerial warfare. Aircraft were lost for many reasons beyond enemy action. Mechanical failures struck without warning at altitude. Fuel exhaustion left pilots with no choice but to glide toward whatever ground lay beneath them. Navigation errors in poor weather pushed formations far off course. Pilots nursing damaged aircraft across hundreds of miles of hostile territory sometimes ran out of options before they ran out of Germany. When Allied aircraft came down relatively intact, German salvage teams moved with practiced urgency to recover them. The Luftwaffe maintained specialized units designated Bergungsbataillone, salvage battalions, whose specific responsibility was to investigate crash sites, assess recoverable equipment, and transport usable material to repair facilities before it could be destroyed by Allied strafing attacks. Every wrecked Allied aircraft attracted attention from other Allied pilots, who understood perfectly well what the Germans would do with an intact enemy machine. Speed was essential. A promising wreck could be dismantled, documented, and loaded onto transport vehicles within hours of landing. The salvage crews worked systematically, photographing aircraft before touching them, noting the condition of engine, airframe, instruments, and armament. Recovered aircraft deemed suitable for repair were transported to facilities at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's central flight test establishment, for further assessment. Rechlin had been designated the official Luftwaffe testing ground on February 26, 1935. Located approximately 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin, near Lake Müritz, it had grown into a sprawling complex covering 234 hectares, with satellite facilities at Rogentin and Lerche for specialized testing. The datasheets produced at Rechlin were considered so reliable that aviation historians still consult them today. It was here that captured Allied aircraft underwent systematic evaluation by test pilots trained to extract accurate performance data from unfamiliar machines without the benefit of operating manuals or technical documentation. The most innovative use of this captured material was organized by General Adolf Galland, who commanded Luftwaffe day fighter operations. In 1943, Galland established a unit with an unusual purpose and an unusual name. It was called Circus Rosarius, Rosarius's Circus, after its founder, Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius, an experienced pre-war test pilot who understood that written technical reports had limited value for frontline aviators who would never read them. The unit's official designation was the 2nd Staffel of the Versuchsverband Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, the 2nd Squadron of the Experimental Unit of Luftwaffe High Command. Its operational concept was straightforward but genuinely innovative. Rather than filing intelligence reports in administrative offices, Rosarius and his pilots would bring actual enemy aircraft to operational Luftwaffe bases, land them on the same grass where German fighters were parked, and demonstrate them directly to the men who faced them every day. Formation leaders would be permitted to fly mock combat against the captured aircraft. They would see with their own eyes how the enemy maneuvered, learn its acceleration profile, its turn radius at various speeds and altitudes, its climb rate and diving characteristics. They would leave with practical knowledge, rather than theoretical summaries. The unit operated initially from Oranienburg near Berlin, before relocating to Göttingen in 1944. All aircraft operated by Circus Rosarius carried the unit code T9, making them immediately recognizable. German technicians typically retained the original Allied camouflage schemes to maintain authenticity during demonstrations, but painted the undersides and tail surfaces bright yellow, RLM-04, as standard anti-fratricide marking. Luftwaffe pilots and anti-aircraft gunners were trained to recognize this configuration and hold their fire. The sight of American and British fighters lined up alongside German machines at Luftwaffe airfields created a surreal visual record that veterans recalled for decades afterward. The most thoroughly documented P-51 acquisition was Todd's aircraft, assigned the German code T9+CK. A second Mustang entered German possession on June 6, 1944, D-Day itself. Second Lieutenant Thomas Fraser of the 334th Fighter Squadron, 4th Fighter Group, went down near Cambrai in his P-51 B-15, serial number 43-24825, which he had named Jerry. German forces recovered the aircraft intact. It was assigned to Circus Rosarius and dispatched to demonstrate American fighter capabilities to Hungarian air units, Axis partners who flew Focke-Wulf 190s and needed to understand what they would face when American escorts appeared over their territory. The aircraft, nicknamed Jerry, remained operational until December 10, 1944, when it was lost in an accident that killed its German pilot, Oberleutnant Leupold. Maintaining captured aircraft was inherently dangerous work. Spare parts were unavailable. Documentation was absent. Pilots flew machines designed for a different cockpit language, a different set of reflexes. The risks were substantial, and the accidents were predictable. By the end of its operational existence, Circus Rosarius had evaluated and demonstrated at least 6 P-51 variants, including B, C, and D models. The intelligence gathered was comprehensive, accurate, and professionally compiled. What the Luftwaffe lacked was any means to act on it effectively. The technical assessment of the captured P-51 Mustang, conducted at Rechlin and through Circus Rosarius operations, produced findings that were detailed, professionally rigorous, and deeply unfavorable to Germany's position in the air war. Hans Werner Lerche's evaluation, later documented in his 1977 memoir, published under the title Test Pilot by a Fiesler und Focke-Wulf, and released in English in 1980 by Janes Publishing as Luftwaffe Test Pilot, remains one of the most reliable first-hand accounts of how German aviation professionals assessed their principal adversary. Lerche approached the Mustang without pilot operating manuals, without technical guidance from North American Aviation, and without any of the documentation that would normally accompany a new aircraft type entering a test program. German evaluation pilots at Rechlin operated this way by necessity and had developed methodical procedures for exploring an unfamiliar aircraft's flight envelope carefully, probing its characteristics while remaining alert to dangerous handling qualities that might kill an inattentive pilot. The absence of written guidance made their work more hazardous. It also meant their findings reflected actual performance rather than manufacturer specifications. Speed was the most immediately apparent quality. The P-51D achieved approximately 440 miles per hour at 24,500 feet when operating at war emergency power settings, decisively faster than both the Messerschmitt Bf-109G and the Focke-Wulf 190A at comparable combat altitudes. This was not a marginal difference. A German pilot who found a Mustang behind him could not simply accelerate away. If the American chose to pursue, he would close the distance. The pursuit was one-directional and largely inevitable. The source of this speed advantage lay partly in the wing design. North Americans' engineers had applied laminar flow aerodynamic principles that were still relatively novel when the aircraft was designed in 1940. The wing's airfoil shape maintained smooth airflow over a greater percentage of the surface than conventional designs, reducing drag at high speeds and converting engine power into forward velocity with less waste. German evaluators recognized the design's significance and noted it in their reports. But speed alone did not explain the transformation the Mustang had brought to the air war. The decisive quality was range. With two 75-gallon external drop tanks mounted beneath the wings, the P-51 carried a total fuel load of 419 gallons. Later operations used 108-gallon tanks, extending range further still. The Packard Merlin engine consumed approximately 65 gallons per hour at economical cruise settings, giving the aircraft a practical combat radius exceeding 400 miles from bases in England, sufficient to reach Berlin and return. German technical intelligence had calculated these figures from measurements of captured aircraft fuel tank capacities cross-referenced against known engine consumption data. The arithmetic was simple, and its implications were unmistakable. The comfortable hunting ground that had existed beyond escort fighter range, where German interceptors had inflicted such catastrophic losses on unescorted bomber formations through 1943, no longer existed. The entire defensive geometry of Reich airspace had been rendered obsolete by the fuel tank capacity of a single aircraft type. High-altitude performance completed the picture. The Packard V16507 engine, the American-built Merlin, produced 1,490 horsepower at military power and 1,720 horsepower at war emergency setting. These figures were not dramatically superior to German engines of comparable displacement on paper. The Daimler-Benz DB605, powering the Messerschmitt 109G series, displaced 35.7 liters compared to the Merlin's 27 liters and produced comparable horsepower at rated altitude. The critical difference was what happened as the aircraft climbed. The Merlin incorporated a two-stage, two-speed centrifugal supercharger developed by Sir Stanley Hooker at Rolls-Royce and maintained in the Packard production version. This system compressed intake air through two sequential stages, maintaining near sea-level atmospheric pressure in the engine cylinders at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. German engines used single-stage superchargers optimized for the medium altitudes where most tactical combat had historically occurred. Above 20,000 feet, their power fell off rapidly. The Merlin maintained its output while German engines weakened. At the bomber escort altitudes of 25,000 to 35,000 feet, where the B-17s and B-24s flew specifically to avoid light anti-aircraft fire, the P-51 had power reserves that German interceptors lacked. A Bf-109 pilot who held a turning advantage at 15,000 feet might find himself outclassed entirely when combat drifted higher, his engine struggling for air while the American's Merlin continued producing full power. German evaluators did identify one genuine area of advantage for their own aircraft. At certain speeds and medium altitudes, the Messerschmitt 109 could achieve a tighter sustained turning radius than the Mustang. A skilled German pilot in a turning fight under specific conditions might work into a favorable firing angle. Experten, experienced German aces, noted this. Kurt Bühligen, who scored 112 aerial victories and flew extensively against American opponents, stated in post-war interviews that the 109 could outturn the P-51 and that German cannon armament was superior to American machine guns in destructive power per hit. Both observations were accurate. Neither was sufficient. American fighter doctrine had evolved specifically to avoid fighting on terms that favored German aircraft. P-51 pilots were trained in energy tactics, diving through German formations at high velocity, making a single firing pass and zoom climbing away before the opposition could respond. If a 109 attempted to follow a Mustang in a steep dive, the American simply pulled away. If the German tried to climb after a Mustang extending its lead, superior altitude performance allowed the American to increase the distance until the pursuer abandoned the chase or ran out of fuel. The armament comparison reinforced this reality at the squadron level. The P-51D carried 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns with a total of approximately 1,880 rounds, several seconds of continuous fire. The weapons were reliable, easy to maintain, and provided a dense pattern forgiving of minor aiming errors. German cannon were individually more destructive, but carried severely limited ammunition. A Messerschmitt 109 might have 60 to 150 rounds for its nose-mounted cannon, 2 or 3 seconds of firing time, demanding precise marksmanship under extreme stress at close range. That standard of gunnery required years of training and combat experience to achieve consistently. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe no longer had years to spend on training. The intelligence gathered at Rechlin and demonstrated across Luftwaffe airfields by Zirkus Rosarius reached command channels with professional accuracy and appropriate urgency. The reports were filed, reviewed, and distributed through proper administrative procedures. They described an aircraft that outperformed every German piston-engine fighter in the qualities that mattered most for the escort mission. They explained precisely why the strategic situation over the Reich was deteriorating. What the reports could not do was reverse the arithmetic of industrial warfare that was grinding the Luftwaffe toward collapse. The turning point came in late February 1944. The Americans designated the operation Operation Argument. History would remember it simply as Big Week. Over 6 consecutive days, from February 20th through February 25th, combined forces of the 8th Air Force flying from bases in England and the 15th Air Force flying from Italy launched a sustained, coordinated assault on German aircraft production facilities across the Reich. The scale was unlike anything the air war had previously seen. American bombers flew approximately 3,800 sorties during those 6 days. The 8th and 15th Air Forces together dropped approximately 10,000 tons of bombs on aircraft factories, assembly plants, engine works, and component manufacturers. Formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators struck targets across a broad arc of German industrial territory. Brunswick on February 20th, Leipzig and Gotha on the 24th, Regensburg and Augsburg on the 25th. Nearly every significant aircraft production center within range was struck at least once during those 6 days. The American losses were severe by any previous standard. The 8th Air Force lost 137 heavy bombers during Big Week. The 15th lost 89. A total of 226 aircraft destroyed, with more than 2,600 American airmen killed, wounded, captured, or listed as missing. In the context of 1943 operations, numbers like these had been considered unsustainable. The second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943 had killed the unescorted deep penetration mission as a viable strategic instrument precisely because those loss rates could not be absorbed indefinitely. But Big Week was different in one critical respect. The bombers were no longer alone beyond the escort boundary. P-51 Mustangs flew with them all the way to the target and back. When German interceptors rose in strength to defend their industrial heartland, they met not only the defensive fire of bomber formations, but aggressive American fighters operating deep over Reich territory. The Luftwaffe's carefully constructed defensive system, designed to punish unescorted formations over German soil, encountered an enemy who had eliminated the unescorted phase entirely. The cost to Germany in those 6 days was catastrophic in a way that raw aircraft numbers could not fully capture. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 17% of its experienced fighter pilots during Big Week, roughly 100 veterans killed in less than a week of combat. These were not trainees with minimal hours. They were aviators whose skills had been developed over years of operational flying, men who knew how to survive against difficult odds, men who trained the pilots beneath them and held their units together through professional competence and hard-won experience. They could not be replaced on any timeline that mattered. The mathematics of attrition that followed were recorded in Luftwaffe administrative documents with the same precision that characterized German military record-keeping throughout the war. In May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 489 trained fighter pilots. German flying schools produced 396 replacements during the same period. The deficit of nearly 100 qualified pilots in a single month represented a hemorrhage that the training system could not close, not because the system lacked ambition, but because the system itself was being strangled by the same fuel shortages and Allied bombing that were destroying the operational force. For the full calendar year of 1944, German day fighter pilot attrition approached 90%. The number is so large that it requires pausing to consider its full meaning. Nearly every pilot who began the year flying day fighters for the Luftwaffe was dead, captured, or medically incapacitated before the year ended. The men who replaced them arrived with progressively less training, less experience, and less ability to survive their first engagements against opponents who had become steadily more skilled and more numerous. German aircraft production, managed by Albert Speer's industrial reorganization, actually peaked in 1944 at approximately 36,000 combat aircraft. Factories dispersed to avoid bombing continued to produce airframes. Assembly lines wrecked by Allied raids were rebuilt and resumed output. On paper, the Luftwaffe was receiving more aircraft in 1944 than in any previous year of the war. The numbers suggested a force that was strengthening rather than collapsing. The numbers were misleading. Those aircraft increasingly sat on airfields without aviation fuel, because Allied bombers had systematically attacked the synthetic oil plants that produced it. When they did fly, they were flown by men with training measured in dozens of hours rather than hundreds. Men who were being introduced to combat in aircraft they had barely learned to operate, against opponents whose skills and numbers increased with each passing month. An air force requires more than aircraft. It requires fuel to operate them and trained men to fly them with any reasonable expectation of survival. By the summer of 1944, Germany had neither an adequate supply and no realistic prospect of recovering both simultaneously. The deterioration of Luftwaffe fighter strength through 1944 was not invisible to the men responsible for directing it. General Adolf Galland, who served as General der Jagdflieger, the commander responsible for day fighter operations, had watched the situation develop with growing alarm from the moment long-range American escorts began appearing over German territory. He had helped create Circus Rosarius specifically because he understood that his pilots needed every possible tactical advantage against an enemy whose material advantages were becoming overwhelming. His position gave him access to the most accurate operational data available. What he did with that data illustrated the profound dysfunction that had come to characterize the upper levels of German military command. The pattern had begun even before Big Week. Toward the end of 1943, Galland reported to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that American fighters had been encountered over Aachen, deep inside German airspace, far beyond the range that escort aircraft were believed capable of reaching. The implications were strategically significant. If American fighters were appearing over Aachen, they would soon appear over the Ruhr industrial region, then over central Germany, then over Berlin itself. The entire defensive architecture of Reich airspace was built on the assumption that unescorted bombers would eventually enter German territory. That assumption was becoming obsolete. Göring's response to this intelligence was recorded in Albert Speer's Nuremberg testimony of June 1946, and it stands as one of the more remarkable documented instances of institutional denial in modern military history. Göring announced by official decree that the American fighters had not been present over Aachen. He stated that this was his official order. He instructed Galland to accept it as fact. Galland, constrained by military hierarchy and fully aware of what he had seen in operational reports, could only acknowledge the order. The American fighters, by Göring's authority, had not been there. This exchange was not an isolated incident. It reflected a pattern of command behavior that had developed as the gap between official optimism and operational reality widened to the point where reconciling them honestly became psychologically and politically impossible for men whose positions depended on managing Hitler's expectations. Accurate reporting of deteriorating conditions invited punishment. Institutional survival required maintaining positions that the evidence had long since abandoned. The result was that the Luftwaffe's technical intelligence, which was accurate, professionally assembled, and clearly understood by the men who gathered it, arrived at the strategic level in an environment that actively discouraged acting on it. By the time the P-51's capabilities were undeniable to everyone, including Göring himself, no tactical or technical response remained that could reverse the strategic situation. The German military did attempt responses. The Gefechtsverband concept paired heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190 Sturmbach assault aircraft with Messerschmitt 109 escorts. The Sturmbach variants carried additional cockpit and engine armor and were equipped with heavy 30mm Mk-108 cannon specifically intended to destroy American heavy bombers with concentrated close-range fire. The tactical logic was sound in isolation. The armored assault aircraft would bore through bomber defensive fire at close range, while the escorting 109s kept American fighters occupied. In practice, the concept proved extraordinarily difficult to execute against alert P-51 formations. The heavily armored Sturmbach aircraft were sluggish and poorly suited to air combat at any speed. If American fighters intercepted them before they reached the bomber stream, they became easy targets. The escorting 109s were routinely outnumbered by Mustang formations that had developed aggressive counter-intercept tactics specifically designed to break up German attacks before they could concentrate against the bombers. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter represented a technological response of a different order entirely. Its twin Junkers UMO 004 turbojet engines propelled it to speeds between 540 and 560 miles per hour, more than 100 miles per hour faster than any piston engine fighter either side could field. Four 30mm Mk-108 cannon provided firepower capable of destroying a heavy bomber with 2 or 3 hits. In theory, the Me-262 could slash through American formations with impunity, too fast for propeller-driven escorts to catch or engage effectively. The practical limitations were severe, and in combination, decisive. The JUMO 004 engines had service lives measured in hours rather than the hundreds of hours expected from piston engines. Maintenance demands were extreme and required specialized knowledge that frontline units struggled to develop under combat conditions. Production never reached the numbers needed to establish meaningful air superiority over any portion of German airspace. Most critically, the Me-262 was desperately vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when its speed advantage over piston-engine aircraft vanished and its maneuverability was at its lowest. American pilots recognized this vulnerability quickly and adapted their tactics to exploit it. 51. Formations developed the practice of loitering at altitude near known jet airfields, waiting for Me-262s to return from missions and descend through their most vulnerable phase of flight. The Luftwaffe was forced to station conventional fighters on combat air patrol over jet bases to protect the revolutionary aircraft during landing, consuming scarce fuel and experienced pilots to solve a problem created by the weapon system that was supposed to provide strategic relief. Kurt Tank, the designer of the Focke-Wulf series, experienced the performance situation with personal directness. In late 1944, flying an unarmed TA-152H prototype on a ferry mission from Langenhagen near Hanover to Cottbus, Tank received a ground control warning that enemy fighters were approaching. Looking behind him, he identified the distinctive silhouettes of P-51 Mustangs closing at speed. He had no weapons, he had no escort. He engaged the MW-50 methanol water boost injection system and applied maximum emergency power, accelerating away from the pursuing Americans and escaping. The Ta-152H was the most advanced German piston-engine fighter to reach operational service, entering that service on January 27, 1945. It was produced in numbers insufficient to affect anything. Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, represented the Luftwaffe's final attempt at a major coordinated offensive operation. More than 1,000 German fighters, gathered in secrecy over the preceding weeks, launched a coordinated surprise attack against Allied airfields across Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France on New Year's morning, timed deliberately for a moment when Allied aircrew might be recovering from the previous night's celebrations. The operation achieved tactical surprise. Allied airfields were struck across a broad front. Estimates of Allied aircraft destroyed ranged from 305 to nearly 500, depending on the accounting method applied. The cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic, and unlike Allied losses, completely irreplaceable. In a single day's operation, 234 German pilots were lost, 143 killed or missing, 70 captured, and 21 wounded. Among the dead were 3 Geschwaderkommandore, wing commanders, 5 Gruppenkommandure, group commanders, and more than 14 Staffelkapitäne, the squadron leaders who provided the operational backbone of frontline units. These were the men whose experience held deteriorating organizations together, whose judgment made tactical decisions under conditions that would have paralyzed less seasoned aviators, whose knowledge of how to survive against overwhelming odds was the product of years that could not be compressed into any training program. Adolf Galland, who had opposed the operation on the grounds that it would waste irreplaceable experienced leadership for uncertain tactical gain, assessed the aftermath without sentimentality. He stated that the German fighter force had received its death blow, that the Luftwaffe had sacrificed its last substance in a single operation that achieved nothing of strategic significance. His assessment was operationally accurate. Within weeks, Luftwaffe day fighter units had been reduced to sporadic appearances, unable to mount consistent resistance against Allied air forces that moved through German airspace with growing freedom. The interrogation of Hermann Göring by General Karl Spaatz on May 10, 1945, at Augsburg, conducted after Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, produced an acknowledgment that carried particular weight given its source. Göring stated directly that the reason for the Luftwaffe's failure against the Allied air forces was the success of the Americans in developing and deploying a long-range escort fighter that enabled bombers to penetrate deep into Reich territory with continuous fighter cover. Without that escort, he said, the air offensive would not have succeeded. When it became clear that such an escort existed, the Luftwaffe had recognized that jet aircraft represented the only possible counter. By then, the strategic situation was beyond recovery by any technical means. The 4th Fighter Group, formed from American volunteers who had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force's Eagle squadrons before the United States entered the war, and who had subsequently transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts before converting to Mustangs, exemplified what the aircraft could accomplish in experienced hands. On March 4, 1944, pilots of the 4th Fighter Group became the first single-engine escort fighters to accompany American bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,400 miles. By the war's end, the group had destroyed more than 1,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and strafing operations, more than any other American fighter unit in any theater of the war. By the close of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force had converted to P-51 Mustangs. Total Mustang claims in the European theater reached approximately 4,950 aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, roughly half of all American fighter claims in the theater. An additional 4,131 enemy aircraft were claimed destroyed on the ground through strafing attacks on Luftwaffe airfields. The Erprobungsstelle Rechlin facility, where Lerche had carefully evaluated Todd's captured Mustang, was itself attacked by 273 American bombers on April 10, 1945. German forces evacuated and demolished the site rather than allow it to fall intact to Soviet troops, who arrived on May 2nd. Hans Werner Lerche survived the war. His memoir documented his evaluations of captured Allied aircraft with the same methodical precision he had applied to the aircraft themselves. He had flown approximately 125 types across 6 years of conflict without ever crashing or seriously damaging a single machine. His professional assessment of the P-51 was not the product of defeatism or propaganda. It was the measured verdict of a master of his craft, applied to an aircraft that had changed the course of the war before he climbed into its cockpit. The lesson embedded in this history is not complicated. The German evaluation of the P-51 Mustang was not a failure of intelligence. It was a success. Test pilots correctly identified the aircraft's decisive advantages. Technical officers accurately calculated its range from measurements of captured examples. Reports reached command channels describing precisely why the Luftwaffe was losing control of German airspace. The intelligence was gathered professionally, analyzed accurately, and communicated through proper channels. None of it was sufficient, because the problem it described was not a problem that intelligence could solve. The Americans could produce more aircraft, train more pilots, supply more fuel, and sustain higher losses than Germany could match or answer. The P-51 was not merely a superior fighter. It was the visible cutting edge of an industrial civilization that had committed its full productive capacity to the war and had no equivalent vulnerability to exploit in return. Goering's post-war admission captured the essential reality without evasion. The long-range escort fighter had made the strategic bombing offensive possible. Without it, the campaign against German industry, oil production, and transportation could not have been sustained. Without that campaign, the conditions for Germany's military collapse in 1945 would not have existed in the same form or on the same timeline. The men of Circus Rosarius flew captured Mustangs across German airfields, demonstrated their capabilities to pilots who would face them the following morning, and filed their reports with professional precision. They understood their enemy completely. Understanding changed nothing. The aircraft they evaluated, the pilots who flew them, and the industrial system that produced both in overwhelming quantity had already determined the outcome of the air war before a single German test pilot climbed into an American cockpit. That is where the historical record leaves us. A force that evaluated its enemy with professional precision, understood exactly what it faced, and was defeated not by ignorance, but by the irreversible weight of industrial and strategic reality. If you found this account useful, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this one, told the same way, with the same respect for the facts. Thank you for watching.